His music displayed elements of the current climate of progressive reform. What was the climate of progressive reform? It included sympathy towards the poor and less fortunate, belief in establishing a national culture that is multi-ethnic, support of radical populism, and an encouragement that the nation's history could be used to serve its future. These ideals were in line with a political and social movement during the 1930s and 40s known as the Popular Front. This movement was comprised mostly of a left and center alliance of communist, radical, and socialist ideas. And a hush falls over the crowd. So why did these ideals work for Copeland? Well, at this period in American history, the Great Depression and World War II, the communist ideals of the Popular Front did not pose a political threat. In fact, there was widespread sympathy with the perspective of these ideals, and many historians believe that there were significant links between the liberal aspects found in President Roosevelt's New Deal and the American Communist Party. The aspects of Appalachian Spring that reflect this aesthetic are identified by renowned Copeland scholar Elizabeth Christ in her article, Aaron Copland and the Popular Front. She states, Appalachian Spring stakes an ideological claim to the future of the Lincoln Republic with its evocation of the Civil War and, not coincidentally, the Shakers, the imagined community at the heart of the ballet, were a communist sect. The interweaving of musical creativity, political involvement, and progressive ideology that characterized the 1930s and 40s for Copeland and proved him to serve him quite well was shattered by the shift of the cultural politics and ideology at the start of the Cold War. With the conclusion of World War II resulting in tensions and hostilities between the United States and Soviet Union over economic, political, and social differences, as well as Soviet aggression and annexation, the political climate became extremely polarizing. Anyone who appeared to sympathize with communism or socialism was identified as possible subversives and came under enormous scrutiny. Due to his affiliations and connections with the leftist organizations, Copeland was not immune to extensive hostile examination. So how did these affiliations and connections surface for Copeland? From 1935 to 1949, investigations discovered evidence that he sponsored or supported over 20 left-wing causes and front organizations. Perhaps the most significant and incriminating event related to Copeland's politics occurred in March of 1949 at the Cultural and Scientific for World Peace, Conference for World Peace. This was an event that centered on the Cold War's effects on the arts, sciences, and professions, and the different means of each area that could contribute to world peace. So what were Copeland's contributions to this conference? Well, one was a speech in which he denounced all parties involved in the Cold War, that the atmosphere it created was one of anxiety and suspicion in which artists are unable to create, and quoted Franklin Roosevelt by saying, "We have learned a simple truth," as Emerson said, "that the only way to have a friend is to be one," which interpreted to some that the United States should change their diplomatic policy and do away with the Truman Doctrine. How did this conference make its way into the public arena? Well, 1 week following the conclusion, Life magazine ran as its lead story in a 2-page scathing attack on the World Peace Conference, featuring photos of 50 of the most well-known participants under the headlines, "Red Visitors Cause a Rumpus," and "Dupes and Fellow Travelers Dress Up Communist Fronts." So Copeland was to endure some backlash as a result of this article. One of the things was he found his name on a list compiled by the FBI entitled Red Channels, the Reports of Communist Influence in Radio and Television, which listed artists and their alleged communist affiliations. Something else was one of his most well-known and patriotic works, The Lincoln Portrait, was actually dropped from the program of President Eisenhower's inaugural concert in 1953. And lastly, as the Life article labeled the attendees and presenters at the conference connected with subversive organizations, it established a catalyst of Copeland's unfortunate enduring of McCarthyism. That's the reckless and unsubstantiated accusations of members of the music, art, and film industry, as well as government and universities, all being government subversives. Copeland was ultimately summoned to appear before the State Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator Joseph McCarthy. Enduring the rigorous investigation affected Copeland somewhat financially and physically. However, it is difficult to know for sure how much it affected him emotionally, as he rarely spoke of it and was able to outwardly keep his coolly aloof persona. Understanding the artist's processing, it is reasonable to suggest that the effects can be found in the music. A musical example that gives us some insight into this turbulent time in Copeland's life is his one and only opera, The Tender Land. As successful as Appalachian Spring was from the premiere, The Tender Land was met with less than enthusiastic reviews and reactions, as we'll discover. How did he come to write this first opera? In early 1952, he was commissioned by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein to write an opera for television, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the League of Composers. Copeland decided to write The Tender Land as a smaller work that would also be conducive to college and university stages. He had hoped to write an opera score that would prepare him to write something much grander, which, incidentally, never came to pass. As with most composers of opera, Copeland did not go it alone. He turned to dancer and artist Eric Johns, who wrote under the pseudonym Horace Everett, and this was his librettist. The two set out to create a new art form that was set apart from the typical opera of the day. In a letter to Copeland from Johns, recently after the opening, he stated, "We must stress the point that our work is in the nature of an operatic tone poem. We must be very definite as to the dangers of naturalistic treatment." So then we come back to the opera's limited success at the beginning. To the surprise of most opera-goers, it was not a large-scale, drama-filled story with culminating events that satisfied conflict-resolving tragic or joyful endings. Instead, the opera was more of a meditative piece, focusing rather on the theme of the passage of time and the resulting inevitable loss. Fortunately, the initial failure of The Tender Land was not from a weakness in the artistry or the score or the messages of the text. It seems rather to have stemmed from the misunderstanding between the intent of the creators and the expectation of the critics and audience. Johns also claimed that the initial failure was due to poor directing. He and Copeland had provided the bones of The Tender Land, and the director was to enflesh the bones. This important element seemed to be lost on the early productions, according to Johns. Even with all of the opera's struggles, some might argue that The Tender Land held a unique grip on Copeland and couldn't let go. As part of a panel discussion for the bicentennial that took place in Washington, D.C., with composers Roy Harris and Virgil Thompson, Copeland admitted that of all his works, The Tender Land was his greatest frustration. It was his longest composition, most extensive vocal writing, and captured the essence of the prairie more than any of his other works. But it never caught on. What was it about the opera that Copeland was so attached to? Perhaps it was one of the only ways he was able to express himself and his life at the time through the text and the music of the story that he and Johns were telling. The coming-of-age tale of The Tender Land centers on Lori Moss, a Midwestern farm girl on the eve of her high school graduation. She desires to go off and experience life in the world so wide. Her ma, a sympathetic but never experienced much of the world herself since she had been obligated to remain at home with Grandpa, a well-meaning but overprotective father figure. Onto their farm come Martin and Top, migrant workers who Grandpa hires despite his misgivings that you can't trust strangers. At Lori's graduation party, Grandpa drunkenly overreacts when he finds Lori and Martin kissing. The young people decide to elope, but Top successfully urges Martin to reconsider for fear of leading Lori into a life of a vagabond. The two boys decide it best to skip town. At daybreak, Lori discovers the boys' flight and resolves to leave anyway, in search of her own destiny. Ma and Laurie's kid sister Beth protest unsuccessfully, and the opera ends with Ma facing a new day and turning to Beth as the new vehicle for her hopes and dreams. Given Copland's societal involvement and what he was experiencing during this time in his career, how was he moved by events to compose this opera? Even though aspects of the Tenderland, such as plot, musical style, and vernacular, seem to be connected more with the time frame of the Depression era, there is also a display of the cultural climate of the 1950s. Again, according to Copland's scholar Elizabeth Christ, anxiety and bitterness pervade the work. That can be seen in how the work seems to yearn for a simpler time in America, before the Cold War and Senator Joseph McCarthy. Copland himself described the climate of the Cold War as a mood of suspicion, ill will, and dread. These characteristics can be found throughout the opera. An example can be found in the opening scene when Ma is singing of the cold, cold weather. There's an allusion to this as referring to the climate of our country's politics during this era. In addition, the opening scene subject deals with the news of a sexual assault in the next town over. Christ points out that innocence has been lost long before the curtain rises. The most famous line in the opera comes from a not-so-subtle jab at the climate created by McCarthyism. Ma Moss suspects Tom and Martin as the men accused of sexually assaulting the two girls in the next town, and immediately she's worried about Laurie. After Martin and Laurie are caught kissing, Ma accuses the two men of the crimes. A neighbor reports that the culprits have already been caught, but Grandpa Moss mutters, "They're guilty all the same." Audiences at the time literally gasped at the delivery of this line. What has happened to the Tenderland since the 1950s has, in part, brought us to how we will experience it this evening. A significant turning point in the revival of Copland's opera occurred in 1987, when theater and TV director Arvin Brown and conductor and professor Murray Sidlin collaborated on a production at the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven, Connecticut. Perhaps the most important adaptation made to the Tenderland, which you are witnessing this evening, was the reduction of the orchestration to 13 instruments. As you can see, it's the same orchestration that is called for the original performance of Appalachian Spring. This allowed the instrumental forces to match the intimate nature of the plot themes and the vocal demands, an aspect that appeared to be working actually in opposition to the essence of the work in the past. What was the effect of the reorchestration? According to Sue Klein, Director of Licensing at Boosey & Hawkes' New York office, there were more productions of the Tenderland with chamber orchestra in the 3 years 1997 to 2000 than there had been in the 3 decades prior to the publication of the Sidlin reduction. The orchestral suite you are about to hear features important musical highlights from the opera. It begins with music from the introduction to Act 3, but also includes the music that opens the entire opera and sets the scene. Then we move to Once I Thought I'd Never Grow, also known as Laurie's Song, a poignant solo contemplating the past and future of the soon-to-be high school graduate. Heard next is the moving love duet between Laurie and Martin, which includes the only mention of the title, The Tenderland, in the entire work.
So
is Stomp Your Foot, which is a fiddle dance featured at Laurie's graduation party, and some would say Copland's finest writing of this style. The complexity of the texture and the rhythmic drive create a rousing barn dance. The dance abruptly segues to the dramatic and conflicted tenor solo, Daybreak Will Come, sung by Martin. This is where he contemplates starting a life together with Laurie or leaving so that as not to subject her to the future of a vagabond. The drama transitions to instrumental music taken from the Hire a Stranger trio with Grandpa Moss, Top, and Martin from Act 1. As Grandpa Moss is reluctant to hire strangers to work on his farm, Top and Martin are very persuasive in this lively dance tune that has a slightly awkward rhythmic character. The suite closes with one of the most famous songs from the opera, Promise of Living. As a hallmark of Copland's imposed simplicity style from the 1930s and 40s, the selection in the opera is filled with tuneful melodies and folk song influences. In the suite, it is written for vocal duet, as opposed to a quintet found in the opera. The musical form captures a metaphor of people coming together for a common cause, in this case, preparing for the harvest. The instrumental layering of the established melody, interwoven with a counter melody taken from the revivalist song Zion's Walls, displays a relationship development among vocal and instrumental forces. The counterpoint emphasizes the interdependence of those musical lines and the personal relations from the opera. Promise of Living is a musical representation of social harmony and individuals working in concert to reach a shared goal. This single chorus perhaps epitomizes Copland's social and political persuasions at the time. Establishing a progressive vision of community as a distinct collective built through common experience and shared labor, Copland's music and art shines through to challenge the principles of both McCarthyism and post-war liberalism. To conclude this evening's program, we will now perform Copland's Suite from the Tender Land, arranged for chamber ensemble by Marie Sidlin.